Today's class is Tzaddik Baralo, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. So I want to apologize. It's a very tough topic and a very tough time. You know, here we are right after the earthquake, and that's followed many terrorist attacks, suicide bombings, other tragedies, ranging from tsunamis to the Holocaust, which was recently commemorated. How do we make sense of it all? How do we go forward? How do we continue as believing Jews, as trusting Jews, when all these tragedies happen? Admittedly, I don't expect we're going to have to go through this with all the answers, especially not in just one talk. Maybe we'll even give a couple of talks on this topic. But what I'd like to do at least is to try to begin to explore the complexity of the topic, go through several possibilities that are discussed in the Talmud, and then maybe as we move forward in our lives, next time we face a tragedy or something difficult, we'll have a little bit more ammunition in being able to try to deal with it. But first of all, a few definitions. We believe that God is omniscient. He's all-knowing. He knows everything, by the way, about every single one of your lives, every detail. He knows it all, whether you put him on private on Facebook or anything like that. He knows everything. He's omnipotent. He's all-powerful. Can control anything, anywhere, complete dominance. And number three, he's benevolent, totally and completely good. He loves us. So the truth is, we could easily explain all suffering, or I would call excuse all suffering, by simply taking away one of the definitions of God. Let's try it. Let's say God was not all-powerful. He was all good and all-knowing, but not all-powerful. So why did bad things happen to good people? If God's not all-powerful? He could control it. Oh, I tried to stop. I couldn't, sorry, right? And if God's all-powerful and all-good, but not all-knowing, why did bad things happen? Oh, that happened to you? Oh, that you didn't get to know, right? And if he's all-powerful and all-knowing, but not all-good, why did bad things happen to good people? Okay. That's a good one, right? So you could easily explain suffering, simply take away one of the Jewish definitions of God. But as believing Jews who accept these definitions, in a sense, it's a little harder for us because we can't take away those definitions. You know, there was actually a rabbi, a conservative rabbi, whose son had suffered from a terrible disease. In this disease, his son aged very quickly, to the point that his son died when he was extremely young. And this rabbi writes in his book, when my son was taken from me, at that point, I could no longer pray to God. Here I was, a rabbi who's supposed to counsel others on their tragedies, and I could not go on. Until one day, I realized it was not God that took my son, it was nature. And then I was at peace. Based on the Jewish definitions of God, the traditional ones at least, why could we not accept that explanation?
Because nature is God.
Hashem controls nature. Hashem is all-powerful. He's more powerful than nature as well. You know, imagine you have a bus driver. He's driving down the street. And in the middle of the street, it's a little kid, doesn't see the bus, and the bus driver says, this is going to be fun, steps on the accelerator, boom, mows the kid down. Good or evil? Evil. Okay. What if driver's going down the street, kid's in the middle of the street, and there's a bystander standing on the side. And let's pretend the bystander knows 100% that he could save the kid with no risk to his own life. But instead says, I'd rather watch what happens, and he stands by and watches the kid get mowed down. Good or evil? Evil. That means even though he didn't do it himself, but if he had the ability to stop it and he stood by watching, that's also evil. So if you say that God is all-powerful, but allows nature to run its course, then in a sense you're basically saying God's like that bystander saying, right? So we really couldn't accept that. There's another approach which is sometimes offered in Christianity, and that is that if something good happens, it was God that did it. But if something bad happens, you know who did it? The devil, the Satan, right, the evil one. But God is a God of love. God would never do anything bad. So again, going back to our definitions, why can we not accept that approach either? Because God controls everything. God's all-powerful. Right? If you say that there's a devil and there's God and it's sort of struggling and sometimes God wins and sometimes the Satan wins, then really you're saying there's two gods. right? There's God and there's devil, and they're fighting for power, and, that's basic duality. We believe in one all-powerful, all-knowing, totally benevolent God, and therefore we can't accept that as well. So the bad news is we cannot easily explain away suffering with some of these excuses. The good news is, though, that at the end of the day it means that we trust that we have an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God who is really running the show, and everything is somehow going to piece together properly. Again, we'll see that, we're not going to understand everything, but hopefully at least we have an approach, a beginning, a confidence that things can and do work out. And it is a lot easier to go through life when tragedy strikes to know there is some sort of meaning behind it, to go through life thinking, oh, it was just bad luck and I was wrong place, wrong time. So even though it doesn't necessarily give you all the answers, but it does make life easier to cope with. All right, so the first and most important concept in approaching suffering is to understand that we don't know why a specific bad thing happens. If someone says, why did the Holocaust happen, or why did the tsunami happen, or why did the earthquake happen, the first answer is we don't know. You know why? Because we're not God, and we don't have prophets today. And therefore we don't have access to know exactly why a specific thing happened. That's very important to have that humility. We do, though, believe and trust that God is like our parents, a loving parent. And just like a loving parent, He really, really, really wants what's best for us. At the same time, there are challenges when you're a parent. I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a 2-year-old child. 2-year-old child is sort of old enough to get into all sorts of trouble, but not quite old enough to understand what it is he did wrong. Let's say right over here you've got an electrical outlet. And 2-year-old child's holding a paper clip and goes, oh, this could be fun, and starts moving towards the outlet. Now you're a parent, all right? We're doing parenting 101 right now. Okay, so this is your first child. You say, okay, you know what? I'm not going to run away and start punishing him, right? First, hey, why don't you come over here? Let's go play. And the child looks at you and goes, and keeps going. Now you start raising your voice. Stop that! You better stop right now! Don't put that in there! Put it down! And you raise your hand, and he looks at you, keeps going. He's now about to put the paperclip into the outlet. You come running over. And imagine the slow motion, get there just in time. As his hand is going into the outlet, you slap his hand and save him from being electrocuted. At that point, your 2-year-old child, in his own limited way, asks the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Because from his perspective, his mean mother, unprovoked, comes out of nowhere and causes pain. He didn't set his brother's hair on fire, right? He didn't blow up the house. I mean, it's one of the typical things that would get him in trouble. He's simply doing a puzzle, putting a puzzle piece, and he's getting hurt. And he's not old enough to even understand what it is he did wrong. So the mother can't even explain in a way that he'll grasp it at this point in his life. Now, let me ask you a question. Is there a greater intellectual difference between a 2-year-old child and an adult, or between an adult and God? Where's the bigger difference? Adult and God. So if a 2-year-old child will sometimes have difficulty understanding an adult, how much more so we will sometimes have difficulty understanding God. Truth is, it even happens with adults to adults. Imagine you had a time machine, and you went back in time 1,000 years ago. You took a moral person and transported him to today. And you put him inside an operating room, and he sees 5 men in blue coats and white masks, the guy lying on his back on the table, and they're about to put these needles into the guy. What does moral man going to think's happening?
He's killing the guy.
It's a human sacrifice! Stop it, you barbarians! And what's really happening? It's a doctor saving his life. So even intelligent beings just switch the generation can totally not understand what's really going on. Sort of like imagine having a 1,000,000-piece puzzle, and you only see one piece of the puzzle. And let's say the piece I show you has some green, a little yellow, and a red line, and a blue dot. Any idea what the puzzle is? There's no way. We are seeing such a small percentage of the vast universe. We have such a little concept of what's really going on in this world. And we're going to judge and say, oh, God, you should have done it this way, you should have done it that way, you don't know what you're doing, why this, why that. Who are we? What do we even see? What do we really know about what's going on in the world? So the first concept, the first approach is to understand that we don't know. But just because we don't know doesn't mean it's bad. Doesn't mean there's not an explanation. Doesn't mean there's not a purpose. It just means that we are limited in the amount of information that we have to even make an evaluation. Rabbi Akiva was someone who was known to really live this concept, this idea of Gamzu Tov, and everything that happens is for the best. The famous story told about him, they've heard the story. He was on the run from the Romans. He was a wanted criminal for teaching Torah. And he had a rooster, he had a donkey, which is basically like his car, and he had a torch. And he was looking for lodging in a particular village, and it was booked. He could not find a single place to stay. So finally, he kept saying, Gamzu Tov. Every time he got turned away, Gamzu Tov. Everything happens for the best. Gamzu Tov. And finally, he goes out into the woods with nowhere to sleep, and he sets up camp, lights a fire, and gets ready for the long, cold night out of the woods. All of a sudden, a cat comes, kills his rooster. Just lost his alarm clock. And he says, Gamzu Tova. A lion comes, and eats his donkey. His car is gone. And he says, Gamzu Tova. Everything happens for the best. A wind then comes, blows out his torch, just lost his night lights. He says, Gamzu Tova. Next morning he wakes up, heads back to the village to replenish his supplies, and he sees the village had actually been raided the night before. The Romans had come, they had plundered, they had killed, they had kidnapped, and had they heard his animals or seen the fire, or had he been in the town, they would have captured him. He was on the most wanted list, and it truly was Gamzu Tova. Now, we don't always, in our own lives, certainly not the next day, get to see how the pieces fit together. Sometimes you do, by the way. If you train yourself and just watch every day, every time you think something was bad, pay attention and see what happens the next day and the next day, often you will see, wow, that's why it happened. It really worked out. But we don't always. Sometimes it takes a week, sometimes a month, sometimes a year, or many years. Sometimes we'll never actually see how the connection happens. But everything really does connect. And Rabbi Akiva had this split that literally the next day he saw the connection. The Gemara Psachim actually says, if someone dies in someone's life, do you know what bracha you make? Baruch Dayana Emes. Blessed be the true judge. Which really, if you think about it, that's this concept, right? I just had a tragedy. What do? I don't yell at God. I don't scream. I go, Baruch Dayana Emes. Blessed be the true judge. But when something good happens in your life, you win the lottery, you know what bracha you make? Baruch Hatov HaMeitiv. Blessed be the one that does good for me. So the question is, wait a minute. If I really believe everything that happens is for the best, why would I make a different bracha? Why am I making Hadayan Emes, which is nice on the bad things, but not as nice as Tov HaMeitiv on the good things? What's going on here? Yes?
You understand that, yes, it was a hard thing, but I'm choosing to see that it was good for me.
Yeah, it makes sense. In other words, we're human beings, right? Meaning God knows that we're human. He's not going to expect us to become superhuman, and be able to say Hatov HaMeitiv and start dancing and celebrating on a loss, on a tragedy. Dayan HaEmes, yes, but Tov HaMeitiv, that's too far. But the Gemara says, when we go to Olam Haba, and Mashiach comes, and we see the world from God's perspective, where we understand everything that's happening, we will make the bracha Hatov HaMeitiv on everything that happens, both the seemingly good and the seemingly bad. Because at that point, we will have God's perspective and truly see how the pieces fit together. So currently, in our current lives, we can only make a Dayan HaEmes. But eventually, we'll be able to make the bracha Hatov HaMeitiv on everything. When you think of suffering, and when I say suffering, I mean things that will cause you to question God, what sort of significant tragedies could you think of, or examples of real bad suffering? Yeah.
The
Holocaust. What else?
When the Hasidic kid in Brooklyn got put.
Hasidic kid in Brooklyn, absolutely, yeah. Other examples? Tsunami. And there was like hundreds of thousands of people were killed in that. Earthquake in Nepal, or let's say cancer, AIDS. But I mean, there are some significant tragedies we could think of that would cause one perhaps to question, where is God? What's going on? The Gemara, it's amazing at how far the Gemara goes. What if you stubbed your toe? What if you stubbed your toe? Would you be mad at God and say, God, how did you do this to me? Probably will think, it was my turn, right? Every couple of months, okay, stub your toe, right? The Gemara doesn't accept that. The Gemara goes even further and says, if you put your hand in your pocket to get a coin, you want to go buy a soda. You take out the coin, you go, oh, wrong coin. You put your hand back in and have a 20-second inconvenience. The Gemara says that should not happen. If it's an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God, we should not have any suffering, not stubbing our toe, and not even picking out the wrong coins from our pockets. So when we think of like the cancer and the AIDS and the Holocaust, but really, on a philosophical level, there should be nothing. Not even the slightest inconvenience. If God's really all-powerful, He can control everything. Not even the slightest, smallest inconvenience or pain should ever, ever, ever happen. So the Talmud says that if you pull out the wrong coin from your pocket, that means you should have introspection. A person should examine their actions, say, God must be communicating with me, and there must be a message, some way for me to grow, some way for me to change. So let's take that for a second, and let's sort of bring it to life. Let's say I go over to Chani, and I say, Chani, I've got some Lashon Hara for you. Now, Chani, of course, says, no way. I do not want to hear gossip. That's not for me. I go, no, Chani, this is really juicy stuff. You got to hear it. And the guy says, no, Lashon Hara, Lamed, hey, go to get an easy way. I don't want to listen. And I start telling her anyway. So she covers her ears. You don't know, she's a real tzaddik. She covers her ears. I pull her hands out of her ears, tell her anyway. While I am doing this. So your name again? Ahuva comes running into the room, not knowing about the conversation, opens the door hits my mouth, and I start bleeding. Now, the Gemara said, if a person suffers, even small suffering, they should examine their actions. If I were to examine my actions, what conclusion might I come to as to why God allowed me to get a bloody mouth? Maybe because I was talking Lashon Hara. Now, do I know that 100% that's why it happened? No. We're not prophets. We don't know. Right? It's a reasonable conclusion, right? So in other words, what the Gemara is saying what I should do is I should make a logical deduction. Maybe I should work on my Lashon Hara. Now, what if I were to conclude I should work on tzedakah? You know, I haven't been giving tzedakah recently. Okay, fine. I'll work on my tzedakah. Guess what? If I'm wrong, God will give me another reminder. My mouth will get hit again or something. So God's powerful enough to make sure I get more messages if I need them. But obviously, my goal is to pick up the message the first time, so I won't need the more serious message. Sort of like the parent of a child. It started off with come and play to yelling to eventually slapping the wrist. I mean, just like with a parent, we'll try to get the message across in the most benign way possible, but sometimes, because I love my child so much, I'll be willing to do more and even cause more pain to protect my child from even greater pain. And God is like that way with us as well. Someone once asked in a class on suffering, how can you explain a child who was abused? And it was apparent from the person asking the question that she was talking about herself. And the rabbi who was giving the class, he said, the first rule, of course, we don't know why. We don't know why. But the Rambam says there are three approaches to suffering. Number one, three responses, I should say. Number one, a person who was abused as a child, when they get older, they could become a child abuser. Is that a good response or bad response? Bad response. Second possibility, someone's abused as a child. When they get older, they can help other abused children. They can relate to them better. Good or bad? Good. The third response the Rambam says is no response, to ignore it. The Rambam says that is also a bad response. That God would never allow us to have meaningless suffering in our lives. But when we ignore it and bottle it up, we have allowed ourselves to have meaningless suffering. Instead, we're supposed to try to deal with it and address it and grow from it so we can turn a tragedy into an opportunity. You know, there's a Rabbi Epstein who had a deaf child. And what did he do? He started a school for children who were deaf and hard of hearing. He'll take his challenge and use it as a way to help others. There was a 9-year-old boy in the community where I used to live where he was riding with a scooter down a driveway and couldn't stop himself, and a car was coming at the bottom, and he got hit by the cars, airlifted, and he didn't make it. Now, this particular family was an amazing family. but it happens to be they had just moved to this new house away from the synagogue. They used to live close to the synagogue. They moved further away, and they were now going to be driving to the synagogue. They just started. And when this happened, they immediately said, you know what, they said, moving back to the synagogue, moved closer to the synagogue, they started to grow in their spirituality. The mother, the emunah, the bitachon, the faith and trust in God she had was overwhelming. And during the shiva, I remember they never said they were happy this happened, but they said that they felt this brought them closer to God, brought their family closer together, and somehow again they turned the tragedy into an opportunity. I remember once when I was in my first year in Israel, so I was in the area, you probably haven't heard of it, called Crack Square. So there were some people, at the time, my eyes were hurting me. I wore contacts, and they were hurting, and I was trying different things. Nothing was helping with the eye doctor. My eyes would not get better. And I was there at Crack Square, and I was remembering this concept. You're supposed to have introspection and see how can I change my life, for the better based on something that's happened to me, and try to connect it. So my eyes were hurting. I thought, you know what, maybe Crack Square is not the best place for me to go. Maybe I should at least be more careful where I look, because not everyone's dressed the most sneakily there. So I started to be more careful. That night, my eyes got better. Now, is that why it happened? Maybe. I believe so. But even if it wasn't, it's taking, again, a message from Hashem saying, how can I better myself? The next step is, wait a minute. If God is really communicating with us, and He communicates through suffering, why? Let Him communicate through joy. Why not have a Goodyear blimp come? Let's say Hashem wants to work on Lashon Hara. So instead of hurting my mouth, let there be a Goodyear blimp that says, Tully Bryks, work on your Lashon Hara. Oh, thanks. Okay. Now, say that with a pretty clear message. It doesn't cause any pain, no inconvenience. It's the first thing to realize that everything in life is relative. We spoke before about cancer, about AIDS. What if the worst disease anyone can get was a cold? The worst thing possible was a common cold. Do you know what happens to anyone who has a cold? They'd be locked up in a sealed room. They have the worst thing possible. Because it would be the worst thing possible. And people would fear colds and run away from colds. And you'd be isolated. And if you had a cold, you'd be so miserable. I have the worst thing possible, because it would be the worst thing possible. Now, what if there were no colds? And there was no sickness at all? And either you could sit on a nice comfortable chair or on a hardwood chair. And the worst thing ever was sitting on a hardwood chair. Then guess what? Anyone sitting on a hardwood chair would be suffering, would be miserable. Everything is relative. We only appreciate things we do because there are worse things that could have happened that we know about. I'll tell you even further. What if I decide that I want to hit Dina Denbo? Not because she missed my class twice already, but I just, or because she missed it in a previous seminary, right? But I decide I want to hit her. So I move my arm back and I get ready to hit her. Now, let's pretend it's a world with no suffering. Let's pretend it's a world with no suffering. So what happens? I go, no suffering. Hashem doesn't want me to hurt her. So what does Hashem do? He stops me. My arm is stuck. I can't hit her. Now she doesn't suffer. Now who's suffering? Me! I want to hit her. Wait, God, the world with no suffering, God doesn't want me to suffer either. So what does God do? He takes away my desire to hit her. So now, I don't suffer. She doesn't suffer. But basically, a world without suffering is a world with a bunch of pre-programmed robots who don't have the ability to think or do for themselves. Once we have the gift of free will, and we realize there must be suffering, because people will make decisions and sometimes make poor decisions, God says, you know what? Since there has to be suffering anyway, both because of free will and because everything's relative, I'll utilize suffering in a meaningful way. I'll take suffering that must exist in the world because it needs to function with free will, and I'll, instead of letting it be meaningless, I'll allow it to be meaningful suffering by providing messages for my children through suffering as a vehicle. There are three forms of suffering. Case number one, you have a wealthy man, and the wealthy man has got himself a nice Lexus. And he goes to sleep at night all proud of his Lexus until he sees his next door neighbor got that new Telsa. That all-electric car that, drives, faster than anything, and, and he just can't believe it. I can't believe he got that. He's just in pain. He's suffering, can't fall asleep at night. It's not fair. Why did you get that? Why not me? And he's going on and crying, and he's really in pain. But is that suffering necessary?
Yeah.
No. I want to suggest to you that much of the suffering in our lives is like that, is not necessary. how many times do we get bothered by something that really shouldn't bother us? Do you know what my roommate did? And what she took, and what she did, and it was my clothing, and this, and that, and we go on, and what she said to him, and to her, and to what, and we go on, and we get so bothered by it, and we just stop and think, does it really have to bother me? Did it really have to upset me so much? Perhaps next time we are in pain about something, we should ask ourselves, should this really cause pain? Does this really need to bother me? Sometimes it really does. There are legitimate, real tragedies in life. But sometimes we get bothered by things that really don't have to bother us. And the message, therefore, is not, let me work on my lashon hara, or work on my tzitzis, or work on my, brachos. Message is, let me chill out. That's a better term, right? Let me not let that bother me so much, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is, there are tens of thousands of children that die every year from starvation. Yet there's enough food in this world to feed every single person 3 meals a day. Is that God's fault or man's fault?
Amen.
Right? Has God given us the resources to provide for everyone, and we perhaps have failed to redistribute them properly? But the third, and perhaps most difficult category, is the suffering or death of a child or a baby. What, is God giving a message to the baby? Start working on your crying, you're crying too much, right? You really should stand up to your parents and walk into the room. It's much more difficult when you get to that age. So I want to introduce the concept of a Gilgul, a reincarnation. That we believe a person can lead multiple lives. It's even possible some of us have lived before. Imagine the following scenario. A person lives their life, they go up to heaven, and God says, you did a pretty good job, but you made someone cry during your life. And the pain you caused that person, making them cry, we can't let you into Olam Haba, into Gan Eden. We cannot give you the eternal pleasure that you've been waiting for. And they're like, please, God, let me in. Come on, please. I didn't mean it. It was a mistake. I really didn't realize I made him cry so much. And God says, all right, you know what? I'll give you another chance. And I says, okay, thank you. But God, I don't want to mess up again. Could you maybe just send me back as like a blind person who's deaf and maybe disabled, so I'll be less likely to cause pain to someone, and I can do it right this time? I said, okay, fine, you got it. I'll send you back that way. Your mandate, though, is to make someone laugh. And you're not going to remember any of this. But your mandate in this new life, you make someone laugh, you're into eternity. The guy is reborn as a blind, deaf cripple. Goes through life. When he's 9 years old, he makes someone laugh. And then he dies. Those of us around him look at this poor child and say, oh, the evil God. Look what he did. He created this child who couldn't see, never got to see the beauty of the world, never got to hear his mother's voice. He was crippled. He couldn't even function normally. And he dies at 9. What a tragedy. What this evil, evil God, if he even exists, probably doesn't exist. And really, what did God do? God just gave this child his wish, his dream in their previous conversations. No one knew about it. And he gave him eternity. But what about the family? It's not fair to the family. You're putting this child in the family, and 9 years old, he dies. It's not fair to them. Well, what if God put the child in that family I spoke about earlier, who I know from my old community, who when their 9-year-old child passed away, they used an opportunity to really grow and really connect to Hashem and connect to themselves, and the family grew and got together and got closer, and they ended up making a super impact on the community they lived in, making a difference for thousands of people, all because of that tragedy. So meaning, if God is really all-powerful, he's able to perfectly match up the people that maybe need to live another life, even a shortened life, with the people that have the potential and the capacity to cope, not only cope with it, maybe even to grow from it and grow through it. Next case, and I'll be ante a little bit more, is someone whose entire life was suffering. One thing went wrong after another. This guy had the worst possible life you could imagine. And finally, couldn't take it anymore. That's it. I'm going to go see the great rabbi. And his wife's like, you sure? Yeah, I'm going to go. On his way there, he trips and breaks his leg. He gets mugged. He gets beaten up. Everything goes wrong. He gets a sickness on his way. He gets, lice. This guy, I tell you, he had that kind of life. Talk about bad hair day. He finally gets there. And the Rebbitzin says, please sit down. My husband will leave you shortly. And he falls asleep. He's exhausted. And while he's sleeping, he has a dream. He dreams that he's in Olam Haba. And in his dream, he's walking down the road, and a bus filled with white angels passes him. And it's all different sizes, different shapes, and he realizes those angels represent his mitzvahs. And the bigger angels were like, the really good mitzvahs that he had sincerity for, and he did with love, and really wanted to connect with God, did for the right reasons. And the smaller angels, the ones like he did a mitzvah, maybe like, it wasn't so lishma, he only did so others would be impressed with him, or really, fine, but they were still there. And 10 more buses just like that, filled with white angels, beautiful, angelic creatures, passes by him. And then, driving the same way, a bus filled with black angels passes him, with fangs, and disgusting and gross looking. And again, different sizes, different shapes, and he realizes the bigger ones, like the Averos, he did like really cunning and deceitful and with malicious intent. And there were other black angels that were like, they were a little punier, and they were ones where he did the bad thing, but it was through the peer pressure, and it was difficult to control himself, and he tried, and he couldn't, and fine, still a black angel, but not as bad. And 20 more buses just like that passed by, filled with black, disgusting angels. And they're all heading to the same place. He finally gets there, and he looks. There's a huge balance scale. And he asks the guard, what is this place? He says, this is Beis Din Shel Maila. This is the heavenly court. So who's on trial? You are. The guy's petrified, and the angels start going onto the scale. The white angels representing his mitzvahs go on the right side. The black angels representing his averos go on the left side, and they're going and they're going. He's sort of like a cheerleader, like, come on, go, go. He's like really hoping, knowing that the eternity is at stake. And he sees, unfortunately, that there are more black angels and heavier black angels than there are white angels. He's about to give up hope, and all of a sudden, a heavenly voice asks, has this man suffered at all in his life? And at that point, a bunch of Yisurim angels, a bunch of suffering angels start going on the white side, giving it more strength. Other suffering angels go on the left side, start throwing off some of the black angels. And it's getting closer and closer and closer. And then it stops, so the black angel still slightly stirs, like, no, please, give me more suffering. And he wakes up. At that point, the rabbi comes in. He's ready to meet with the man. He says, okay, I got my answer. The reality is, no one in this world is perfect. Even the greatest rabbi in the world has room for improvement. And everything that we do has a cause and effect. I wouldn't call it punishment. It's a cause and effect. If you eat fattening food, you get fat. Does that mean God's punishing you? You ate that donut, now I'm going to make you fatter? No. There's a nature to the world. There's a natural order of how things work. In the spiritual world, too, there's a natural order as to how things work. When we do Averos, we do things that brings us further from Hashem. It's a cause and effect. It's not a punishment. It's a natural result. When we rebel against Hashem and go against His will, it will bring us further away. There has to be some sort of consequence, some sort of result. With food, it's gaining weight. Here, it's hurting our eternity. The consequence, the result, can either happen in this world or in the next world. 1 second of pleasure in the world to come is worth more than an entire lifetime of pleasure in this world, because it's showing eternity. Mathematically, there's no equation. And so too, 1 second of suffering in the world to come is more painful than an entire lifetime of suffering in this world. And therefore, for people that sin very infrequently, God does the greatest chesed for them by allowing them to have the consequences in this world, and therefore it does not affect their eternity in the next world. And for those people that perhaps are more regular sinners and only do very few good deeds, God allows them or ensures they get their recognition for the positive deeds now, and they won't have it waiting for them in the eternity. So therefore, at the end of the day, the Talmud says, if none of the other explanations work, and there's no other way to understand why the bad thing is happening, then we could trust that, you know what, these are Yisurim Shel Ava. This is suffering that's taking place because of Hashem's love for us. Because since everyone's done something that needs some sort of consequence, He's allowing it to happen now, so we have the ultimate eternal pleasure. In summary, if someone were to ask you why something bad happened in your life, the answer is, we don't know. We're not prophets. We don't have that access anymore to know exactly why it happened. But there are a lot of possibilities. It could be because the idea of everything's relative, could be because the idea of free will, Could be because it's a reincarnation, it's a second life or a third life. Maybe someone's being purified in this world because of the next world, or maybe because Hashem is talking to us. We don't know. Or Gam Zulatov, everything happens for the best. It's any of those possibilities. And if I'm counseling my friend, I will offer all these options. But when it comes to my own suffering, here's the dichotomy. When it comes to my personal struggle, that's when the Gemara says introspection. I should examine my actions. Don't start saying, oh, it must be because Hashem, I'm getting punished now for the world to come. It must be because it's a free will. There must be suffering in the world. No. When I'm suffering, it's time for me to say, how can I better myself? If my mouth's hurting, maybe Lashon Hara, maybe brachos. My leg's hurting, maybe I got to run to do good deeds faster, or not run to do bad things. Whatever it is that is plaguing me or bothering me, I try to connect it to something that I can improve upon in my life and use it as an opportunity to grow. Worst case scenario, I chose the wrong thing, and I've gotten closer to God anyway. So it's a win-win approach. But it's very important that for our friends, we don't say, you must be a sinner. No. For our friends, that's when we try to offer all the other positive alternatives. But for my own suffering, that's when it's time for introspection. At this point, I'm happy to take questions, comments, concerns. I know, like I said, it's a very difficult topic, but I will tell you that if you try to use some of these concepts going forward, both in terms of the introspection for your own life and in terms of just understanding that there's a bigger picture that I don't have access to, it's so much easier to go through things. It's so much more meaningful to go through, to really turn tragedies into opportunities. I know so many people, myself included, who have been through significant difficulties and have really been able to face them with a smile, which is really incredible. Yes, questions, comments, concerns? Yes.
Just a quick comment. I want to say thank you because I think this is like perfect timing considering what's happening in the world now. So this is really helpful.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And by the way, let's take, for example, the earthquake. Now, I wasn't in the earthquake, right? So is it a message for me or not a message for me? So first of all, things happen on a global level. Usually we assume it's a message for all of us. But secondly, anytime I am bothered by something, it makes it a message for me. So hopefully I am bothered by it, in which case I got to think, okay, so, what can I do?
I also want to say thank you because I think that was one of the most clear, for me personally, the most clear answers and straight up answers for me, and it was like really wonderful.
Thank you. Let me say something though. It's much easier to articulate the concepts, much harder to live them. So, we have the notes, we have the tape, but, putting it into practice is going to be harder, but, again, so rewarding if we try.
Yeah. Kind of like what was in his head. Like, I've heard so many times about, like, suffering and, like, how to deal with things, like, all these things. But, like, I never really, like, no one actually ever told me, like, these concepts, like, and I, like, whatever, it's very clear cut, and, yeah, very, very easy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? You give me a tough question. I'm having trouble answering all these.